Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Our Town, an open dialogue with the Wilder family. We are so happy to have you with us tonight. We are joined tonight by members of the Wilder family, and this is a collaboration with them as well as the St. Clair County Library System and Enter Stage Right Theater. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We're going to do some quick introductions and then get into our program. So if you guys just want to wave a little bit when I call your name here, we've got Tappan Wilder, which is Thornton Wilder's nephew and literary executor. We have Rosie Strub, the manager and director of programming of the Wilder family. And then we have Mary Howard from the St. Clair County Library. And I'm Regina Spain, Executive Director of Enter Stage Right, but I am the proud director and designer of Enter Stage Right's production of Our Town that we'll be doing next year in 2021. Everybody else you see on the screen, you're going to meet in detail later, so I'm going to have them escape, and we're going to invite Tappan and Rosie to start our show for us tonight.
Well, thanks, Regina. Thank you all for having us. We're delighted to be here. And I think my job is to say a few things. I don't know if they're right or wrong, but I hope some of them are provocative and it'll help us get into a good discussion about a play I happen to be very fond of, and I know you all are too. So the first thing I want to say is kind of the way I think of it. I think of it as an everyman play. My uncle tried something rather ambitious, and that is to write a play that would speak to everybody. And the only way to have everybody represented on your stage is to sweep off the stage and have nothing on it but a few people and maybe a few objects, which we call scenery. And he was influenced by Shakespeare and Chinese theater and the German theater of the period. But I think mostly the bare Shakespearean stage and going after everybody. And what he was then puts on the stage are the diurnal, the daily events of our lives that we all share, or whatever our station. I don't need to tell you that. You're going to be performing them and acting those parts, growing up, getting married, etc. And two things to say about that. One is, there's no particular drama about any of it. It's kind of everyday life. And the critics that didn't like the play, there's nothing particularly dramatic about it. There isn't. There's little bells, whistles, sounds, movements, roles that people are playing quietly, and the speed with which it's going on. Nothing ever changes in our town. Well, I assure you, it changes very quickly. There's a tremendous amount of speed. People often say that the message of the play is, we need to stop and smell the flowers. And some of you may say that. Banish it from your minds. The speed of life is such that we don't have time, really, to stop and look. But he's going to force you to do that because of the magic of theater. And that raises questions about what the play is about and what the meaning is about. But there's irony in this play, but I happen to think it's loving irony because he loved everybody and was fascinated about how they went about the business of trying to live life. So the key to the whole business is death. People are dying all over the place in our town. And they die all over the place in his other works. And he uses them, as many writers do, to cast light and raise questions and ask questions of meaning about what life is. He uses the most powerful tool of all, which is death. And the source of Our Town as an idea comes from a novel he wrote called The Woman of Andros in 1930. That would be 8 years before Our Town opened. And in it, it's a novel set in pre-Christian Greece on an island. And I won't drag you through the whole novel. It's a very short novel. We could go through it pretty quickly. But there is a scene in it where a woman tells the story of Zeus being asked as a favor to ask to return somebody from dead from the dead for a day. And this, oh, I can't do that. That's impossible. But Zeus has to carry it out because owes this friend the favor. And the god of dead says, well, you can't do that. But Zeus is Zeus. And pretty soon we have a boy returned to a day in his life when he was 15 years old. And he's now, but he has to, in order to do that, he has to pay a price. He has to be both an observer and a participant in that day. It's a kind of sentence, a loving sentence in the story. And I'm not going to read it all, but he talks about he has to say the word. He has to say the words of so many years before, and the onlooker who foresees the end. So the hero is returned to the sunlight and to a certain day in his 15th year. And it goes on and on. It ends with this line. He goes back to the land of the dead, and before he left, he fell upon the ground and kissed the soil of the world that is so dear, that is too dear to be realized, too dear to be realized. If that sounds like Emily, of course it is. He filched from his own work for that period, for that extraordinarily important moment in the play in Act 3. And there's another key to it too. Because if there's anything that's diurnal, how do we go on? We have marriages. M marries N. N marries N. Millions of them, once in 1,000 times. It's interesting. That's a terrible line. It's a mean, sounds mean. Sounds terribly mean, ugly. He didn't mean it that way. He in conversation with Gertrude Stein, they used to say, no, the way to say that line is just a matter of fact. It's just an observation. It is true. Once in 1,000 times, it's interesting. Many marriages aren't. Now, I haven't been to 1,000 marriages, but I think about it often when I do go. There's some they just forget them, but once in a while, they're interesting. So do say that line that way, because then it opens up a floodgate of a man observing life with fascination, how people get along and get over the terrible hurdles that life presents. Absolute fascination. And then we come to, so that's I believe the oldest line in the play. And that's my parents' wedding. Do we have a picture of that, Rosie? Should we put the picture of my parents' wedding up?
No, I'm going to show it to you.
Yeah, I might just show you a picture here. My uncle began writing this play in 1935, about 2 weeks after he attended the wedding. He's the best man. Can you spot the best man? I'm facing the picture as you are. Best man's on the right. There he is, right there. Thank you, Rosie. That's great. And this is in a garden in a little town in South Jersey near Philadelphia. A very hot day, by the way, really hot, really uncomfortable. And my grandmother, in other words, the mother of the bride, made a great fuss about my father, the bald-headed fellow there, not meeting his bride at the altar. In fact, it was in the garden until they met at the ceremony. And my uncle, this is documented for me by the uncle way over here on the far right, the fellow there, Gilbert Curlin, on the other side.
Oh.
There is my mother's brother. It was really a surrogate father to me, a wonderful man. He remembered so vividly my uncle saying, just what I need for what I'm working on. He was not familiar with this famous wives' tale about marriage, and just what I needed for a play he was planning. And as a result of that, my mother's wedding dress, her name is Catherine, is on permanent display in the little town of Moorestown, New Jersey, because our town was really born there at this ceremony, June 1935, on a very hot, uncomfortable day. On the far left, as I'm looking at the picture, you see Isabel Wilder, one of my father's sisters, my aunt, and you're going to see her a little bit later too. Okay, let's go on. Enough of wedding. Enough. Let's get on with the post-wedding picture. So then we come to family. The Wilder family was composed of daddy and two brothers. Here's Thornton Wilder with the glasses, and next to my father, the future groom. He's Amos. His name is Amos Wilder. Well, he still had his hair. We all go bald. The three boys, and Amos Wilder is going to grow up to be a poet, a theologian, literary critic, and also an international tennis star. He was the one that we used to call him the George Gibbs of the family. He had real athletic ability. Thornton was a great walker, but athletics wasn't his game other than walking. And the father was a journalist and goes off to China as a consular official in 1906. Maybe we show the next picture, Rosie. Here they are they're all on their way to China. And in fact, I'm not sure if they're not there already. In 1906. And Thornton is over here, my father here. And Isabel Wilder, and there's a little sister there. I'm sorry, Isabel Wilder. There's a little sister called Janet Wilder. And again, I think we're going to meet them all later, aren't we, Rosie? Don't we have some more pictures later? But what's so interesting about this family is that this is one of the last time there's some one child still to be born a little bit later. But this family is almost intact, you might say, for the last time. They get to China pretty soon. The mother and the kids are back in the United States. She's going to return later, and then she's going to end up in Italy while the father moves from Hong Kong to Shanghai. The children are spread all around. They do not operate as a family, an intact family, almost ever again. The notion of a family around the Christmas table and that sort of thing, the family, the Gibbses, the Webbs, the families that are scattered through his books, all his books, he becomes the portraitist of family and meaning and the importance and emotion in families. And yet he never really experienced any of that himself. And all of them, as we will say, only two of them, of the five kids, there are going to be five, only two of them marry, only one of them has children. They all live in that sense, a kind of lonely life, Thornton in particular. And he, in fact, is going to be traveling during his lifetime most, 200 days a year away from his later base in New Haven, Connecticut, Hamden, Connecticut. And what we have here, nevertheless, is I say, a great admirer and lover of families, but they never had one themselves. And yet, isn't that like the eyes on the wall? Perhaps by observing them so closely, which he did all his life, he was able to write about them with special meaning. He was not in the fire, but he observed the fire, and he is, as I say, their portraitist. Those are a few comments about the family. I want to raise now, kind of come to two larger issues. The play Our Town opens in 1938, early in February. And it was sort of a mixed bag at opening night, or so my uncle and his sister Isabel, who was now helping him, thought. So when they got home the next day after the opening, they decided to not spend on a taxi, but to take the bus. It was a little less expensive. Wasn't sure what the exchequer was going to be like. And when they got home, their mother was waiting for them, the phone was ringing off the hook. While many critics, not many, but enough, didn't like the play, many did. And the audience was lined up at the window, and they had to bring in a police horse to, control the crowd. And when the play shut, oh gosh, I can't remember now the number of performances. It wasn't a huge number. Within a few months, when it went into the amateur market, it was performed almost 700 times in the United States, in all states, but Rhode Island and most of the Canadian provinces. And by this time, it was being done in Europe. Of course, the war was coming, and the lights have never been off for our town. And it, by the way, an international address from the beginning. And he wrote some of it in Switzerland, which was appropriate too. And he meant it to be an international play. But its subtlety is very real. And I think those of you acting in it will have to decide where on the scale you see the play and its subtleties. Lanford Wilson wrote that it is a deadly cynical and acidly accurate play about life. That's one end of the spectrum. At the other end is a rather loving portrait, sometimes seen as sweet, sometimes seen as sentimental. And you have to decide how you feel about that scale. I feel this about the play today, early December 2020. I've learned managing it, and Rosie doesn't have to agree with a darn thing I say. She has her own, thank heavens, her own mind. It's a play not only about everybody, but it's a play for all seasons. And I've grown as the manager of it to see how people discover it for the first time. There are people out there who don't know our town, believe it or not. And there are also people who rediscover it at different points in their life. It's always said to have been terribly associated with the American high school. And that's true. The high schools and junior high schools, that's been its anchor, so to speak, in terms of performance, although professional theaters have done it. But many men still do, believe me. The point is, they find in it, and people who come to see performances when they're older, even if they go back to their grandchildren's performance in the local high school reluctantly, and then find they're entranced by it, they see a play they didn't realize they'd once even been in. So it's a play for all seasons, and you're likely to change your views about it as you grow older or younger or whatever direction you're headed in. So those are just a few general remarks that I hope were helpful as we open the door to your questions. And again, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me to the library, to your local theater. I have been involved in those things in my lifetime before, and I love them to death. And I'll stop now for minutes.
They're great community builders, libraries and theaters. So Rosie, I'd love it if you have things to add.
I feel like Tappan has said almost everything, but I would add, just to your point, Tappan, about the fact that this is a play that often gets sort of set aside as a high school play, that it is, I think, one of the most wonderful ways that younger people can be introduced to theater and to drama, because it's a perfect play. It's, and it's, as Tappan mentioned, you can find in it when you're in high school, you have the soda fountain scene, and it's so exciting to perform the soda fountain scene when you're 15 years old, and then later in life, you think about the monologue about, that you're having all these meals with somebody, and all of a sudden you're 70 and you've been married for forever. And, you can discover that at that point. Or, I would say the moment of the marriage, I think, was not nearly as impactful until I got married. And now I can't go see a production of Our Town and get through that scene without weeping uncontrollably. So just to say that I think it's, it's great that it is performed everywhere, from schools to community theaters to professional theaters to Broadway, because I feel like it's a great entry point into theater for anybody, no matter where you're coming from. And
I
it's
think-
such a pleasure to get to work on this play every day.
Yeah, I think it's funny because it's one of those plays that's so well known and done so much. I think I've just missed it my entire life by that much. So this is actually my first experience with it, believe it or not. And I think the last time it was done in our area was when the local St. Clair Community College did it. I think that was probably 6 or 7 years ago. I think there's some people that are in my cast that were part of it, so they could tell you better. But it's funny because, as a, almost 50-year-old, I picking it up for the first time, and I didn't pick it up until the library came to us and said, "Hey, would you like to partner and do Our Town with us?" And so I'm like, "Okay, sure." And I'm like, "I know a lot of people love that show. I can find a director for it." And I picked it up and absolutely fell in love with it. And I was like, why have I not been experiencing this play before? So that was interesting to me. And then we had our first read. And of course, we're in tears by the end of the first read. And it took several rehearsals. We had to kind of gauge when we were going to do certain scenes, because especially through the summer of COVID and pandemic, and we're rehearsing in the backyard with masks and distancing, and it's still so emotional. So it's so yeah, it's been very fun for me as a director and to do this. But
I think that's an advantage, though, that you're coming to the play without ever having experienced it before, because you're not bringing any of that baggage of being forced to read it at a particular age or having seen X number of productions. I think that's super exciting.
I think so too. And I have the experience of those around me that
There are two major directors in this country. I know of one, I know there's another, I'm just forgetting his name, who had the same experience. In other words, they got hurt playing football, you see. So the coach sort of rolls them off the field and says, "You go over and see, Amy Fabic. Do I pronounce that right, Mrs. Webb? Amy? Go, you see Amy in the drama. They're doing a play. See if you can get in it. You see, it changes their lives." So I hope maybe you'll have some young person or whose life is changed by your performance. That would be great.
Well,
Maybe-
I think that is a great segue for us to bring on our first actor with her statement and question, because she is a young person that that feels very deeply about this production and about this script overall. So Leah, if you want to turn your video and unmute yourself, please. And the floor is yours, man. And this is Leah. She is playing Emily Webb in our production.
I do want to add to the beginning part of my statement that I was in that SC4 production. I actually played Mrs. Webb, and it's cool to be my own daughter. But I wanted to say how much Our Town means to me as a performer, but also as a person who has struggled with loss and mental illness. As somebody who has struggled very heavily with their purpose, being able to express the simple joys of living, as my character says goodbye to the world she has come to know, is one of the most cathartic experiences that I have ever had. And it's one of my reasons for existing still. Things like sunflowers, freshly ironed dresses, hot baths, sleeping and waking up are truly some of the most beautiful things that life can offer. And life moves pretty fast if you don't slow down and appreciate the little things. And this show has twice now helped me see that. Yeah.
That's great. You put your hand on the irony, what I call the loving irony. It is all but impossible to slow up. I mean, it isn't, but it is. You see, that's why that's a really subtle little point to bring out about the play, I think. Good for you.
You really have to make a conscious.
Say cathartic. A lot of people feel it's very cathartic. I know I suffered a terrible loss earlier, and I didn't think I could ever see the play again. It meant a lot to me to be able to see it. So good for you.
Thank you so much. I do have a question for Rosie. My question is, how were you introduced to the Wilders, and what led you to your particular job at the Wilder estate?
That's a great question. I was my connection to the Wilders came through a playwright called Ken Ludwig, who you may know wrote Lend Me a Tenor and Crazy for You and Run Over Buffalo. So after I completed my master's degree in theater management, I began working with him as his manager. And we worked together for 4 or 5 years. And in the meantime, he and Tappan collaborated on a play called The Beaux Stratagem, which is a play that Thornton Wilder began to adapt in the 40s and then set it aside when the war came along and never completed it. And we had the existing manuscript that Thornton had worked on, had never been published. And Tappan and Ken worked together, and Ken actually completed the manuscript. So that was the first Wilder-Ludwig collaboration. And so when Tappan suggested he could use someone to help manage the estate, Ken recommended me, and we sat together and had some coffee, Tappan and I, and the rest is history.
Well, I was drowning. I was drowning in stuff that I didn't understand, you see. I took over the management in 1995 or so, and a few years later, I just was so busy that I needed somebody who also had a theater background. And Rosie was a professional. And so I remember we went to New York and sat around the table, and I just sort of blurted out all my problems. I probably fell into tears. I said, "Won't you please work with me?" And here we are all these years later. That
Are you kidding? I would love that.
2008, right, Rosie?
2008, yep.
2008.
Yeah.
That is amazing. Oh my gosh, I love that.
It's been an incredible journey.
Like
Yep.
it. I'm a little jealous.
Well, now that we know each other, it's a
Yay. So many wonderful opportunities.
Let's say, are you interested in that kind of path, Leah? Is that why you asked the question, or you just?
I'm an English major. I'm a theater person. You know, I've been in a part of theater for the last 10 years of my life. So both of these things are very much a part of my upbringing and my heart. So yes, it's very, very interesting to me and something I would love to pursue. Yes.
Did you study Our Town in high school?
I did. I'm in love with this show. I've seen it so many times. I read it in middle school for the first time, and then high school, and then I did it the year after my mom passed away in 2016 at SE4, and being able to revisit it 6 years later is just, it's an incredible opportunity. You hit the nail on the head by saying it really comes through your life at the most important times, but it hits you in different ways at different stages in your life. Very accurate.
Telling you, Leah will make you cry every rehearsal. Not,
Oh,
you know, I can't wait to get to performances because the audience is going to be in tears. But it's very powerful with the cast that we have. Absolutely.
I have stained a good amount of masks due to crying.
My uncle used to say, as he'd send us off to see a performance in New York, or something, take your handkerchiefs, take your handkerchiefs.
Yeah, we have shows sometimes where we have tissues at the door. We tell people, you know, if it's like an Our Town or a Steel Magnolias or something like that, it's like, hey, you're going to need these hankies. I'm fine. And then they're blubbering. So yeah, absolutely. All right. So we are going to let Leah go, and we're going to pull on Paul Miller. Thank you, Leah. We're going to pull on Paul Miller, which is our Mr. Webb. And just a side note before Paul starts with his, we have done, it feels like the last 3 years, we were doing like a yearly Ken Ludwig production with Treasure Island, and then Sherwood last year, and Three Musketeers was the one that was ready to go when COVID hit. And Leah's been in all three of those.
Wow.
So sword, you know, swashbuckling sword play. We're known for our combat, and so she's been lovely in all those.
Amazing.
Yes. So this is Paul, and Paul is our Mr. Webb, and I will let him take it from here.
Well, thank you, Regina. You know, I'm going to say the same thing that we've already said, and that is that I hadn't read Our Town since I was in college, and I was so surprised by my reaction to it, reading it, you know, this year in middle age, and by the end of the play, I was just a puddle of emotion. It was such a good and interesting read, one that really kind of surprised me. You mentioned, Tappan, that you know, this play can be viewed either as a very cynical view of life and small town, or a very loving view of life in small town. And I wonder what what Thornton's view of small town living was. Did he love and appreciate small towns, or was this sort of a dig at small town living?
Oh, no, no, I don't think so at all. This is a figure who lived himself, as I say, not exactly out of a suitcase, because he was often planted somewhere. He was teaching, or he was putting himself down for X, and not always moving. But 200 days a year, he built a home for his family in 1930 in Hamden, Connecticut, next to New Haven. That was his official home. That's where he voted. His lawyers and doctors and the dentists, of course, were. But he was on the move. And he also, his plays, his novels, they're all set in different places. He's not tied to a particular thing or have a particular negative view one way or the other. He just is looking for the right place that'll provide the vibes he needs for telling his story. And so his famous novel, The Bridge of San Luis Rey, is set in Lima, Peru in 1714. Never went to Lima, Peru. They honor him down there. He's in all the guidebooks, but he never, he just needed that kind of place to tell that kind of story. And he needed a small town to tell this story. Now, he wasn't negative or positive. If you read the afterword that I contributed to the latest version, you'll see him. He's very knowledgeable. He knows perfectly well that our towns are considered to be, by many of you, sinkholes of ignorance, loneliness, and all kinds of terrible things. And the American writers of his period, I was trying to think, Sinclair Lewis, Sherwood Anderson, they all grow up, they're all use them as a foil to tell good or bad things, often bad things. Thornton Wilder's got a different purpose. He's just looking for the right place to put the story, and he puts it in a small town. That's what he needed. Doesn't have the confusion of the city, no streetcars, no, no cars in the way. Picks the right period to get that everyman very simple. He's turning everybody in the stage into some universal statement. You can't do that in a big bubble of noise. And that's why he uses small towns. I must say, I thought of this just as I was coming down. I thought you might like to see what the German cover. The Germans adore Thornton Wilder, and our town very, very well known there. And particularly after the Second World War, was mounted in the rubble of the German cities. Almost immediately, 1945 in Berlin, they were performing our town. And here's the cover of the German edition of our town. It's a city.
That's fascinating.
Kleiner
It's
Stadt.
It looks like Chicago with the one.
Yes, it does.
Chicago.
It looks like Chicago. I think it's Frankfurt, actually, where it's published. I believe it's Frankfurt, but it could be a city anywhere. But the point is, it's about a small town, but it's also about Eine kleine Stadt, and it could be anywhere. Thornton chose to tell it that way. So don't ask him to change it. And it's authentic. The New England village, I think, is very authentic in the American imagination. And he draws on that heavily, but not everybody agrees with me. Anybody want to disagree with me? You certainly can. I can't punch you or anything. You're far away from me.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Paul. We are going to say goodnight to Paul, and we'll bring in Nick Clark, which is playing our George Gibbs. So hello, Nick.
Hi.
Welcome, welcome.
Hi. Now, honestly, I think you might have addressed my question already, Tappan, in your response to Paul. But you've talked about how our town has a sort of international appeal, that it can be an everyman play. And I was wondering if Thornton's vision was for our town to be a sort of universal or a universally accessible play. Do you think he would have been supportive of adapting the context of the play for local audiences, or similarly like modernizing aspects of it?
Well, I don't know. It's a very interesting question, because I happen to be the kind of literary executor, Nick, who believes that a play has to live and evolve, right? It's not a monument in a cemetery that has to be worshiped just the way it is. It evolves with time. It changes. A lot of it, literary executors wouldn't agree with me, right? Because all kinds of terrible things can happen to a property when a new modern temper takes over and they change it. But I happen to believe in that. It's just I believe there's a basic integrity to the play that has to be observed. And I'm willing to see the play modernized, if that's the term. I don't know exactly what that word means. You mean updated? I don't want to say updated, right? But see it evolve in some ways. And Rosie and I have faced these kinds of issues for many years together. Rosie, do you have anything that you want to say?
Yeah,
I'm
a
not.
couple of things.
I'm
It's
not
really
fumbling around
interesting.
here.
No. So part of what I do in my role as manager of the estate is sort of field a lot of questions like this from theater companies that say, we're out in Santa Monica, California. Can we just change it to Santa Monica? Does it have to be Grover's Corners? And what's so interesting is that this play has been performed as Grover's Corners, New Hampshire, all over the world in every language you can think of. It's still Grover's Corners, New Hampshire. And it's one of those things where he worked very hard at making this play as universal as possible. So, and I think the quote is, I'm going to misquote this, Tappan, but it's supposed to be a village gradually becoming the world, because it doesn't really matter that it's set in this town called Grover's Corners, New Hampshire. It doesn't matter at all. It can be, you don't have to change the name if you just perform the text. But one thing that, a few years ago in 2016, Michelle Hausman and Moises Kaufman came to Tappan and said, we're opening this new theater in Miami and we want to do our town, but we want to do it in 3 languages. Because Miami is an international community. It's a community of immigrants from all over, where you have families who speak their native language at home and they speak English in the streets. And we want to convey that through the play. We don't want to change the text. We just want to translate portions of it. And Tappan, as the enlightened executor that he is, said, sure. And so the result was this.
Well, I took a deep breath. Let's say that.
You did take a deep breath, but then you said yes, which, and the result was this beautiful piece of theater where Emily's family spoke Spanish at home. George's family spoke Haitian Creole at home. Everyone spoke English in the streets. And it was just gorgeous. It was a really beautiful production. And the other thing is that
beautiful. Yeah.
It was I have pictures of it, but it's sort of clunky to kind of share screen. You can imagine it. And the other example I would just give, a lot of people heard about the David Cromer production that happened off Broadway at the Barrow Street Theater. And that had this moment at the end where the whole thing was set in modern dress, which is interesting in and of itself, because if you think about the fact that the play takes place at the turn of the century, it's premiering in 1938. And people are dressed like they're at the turn of the century. And David Cromer kind of did a take on that, where it's taking place in 2010. People were dressed like they maybe would have been in the 70s or whatever. You could be like, hey, I had that t-shirt growing up. It was nothing like, but that was an interesting parallel. But then, of course, at the end of that play, everything was performed throughout without sets, without props. And then at the very end, when Emily goes back on her 13th birthday, a curtain is pulled back. And we're in this like very naturalistic kitchen with bacon being fried and pancakes being made, and people are in full costume. And, the result was this assault on your senses because you've been deprived of this, realization throughout the whole play. You've had to use your imagination, and then it's put in front of you. And it's like, so that was another thing that, David proposed this idea to Tappy. And again, you probably took a deep breath. Yes. And the result was pretty startlingly amazing.
I say no too sometimes. I say no sometimes too. Our town is not a Monopoly game. You know how Monopoly has changed, and they have, the original Monopoly game, and then they have Monopoly for Chicago and Monopoly for this. For all I know, they have a Monopoly for Detroit. I don't know. It's not a Monopoly game. There is one game.
From our town.
Games don't change. and the words don't change. uh, but the interpretation and now the translation can change. I think, yeah. I hope you'll be able to see that multilingual performance.
No, I think that's wonderful. It sounds like you really think Thornton put a lot of effort and really did a wonderful job in making the play universal sort of at its outset, so that really over time you wouldn't need to do much modernizing, whatever that might be. But I love the couple of things that you mentioned, how people have adapted it. They sound beautiful. Thank you.
It gets to a whole, Nick, it gets to a very subtle level too that we don't need to get into, but translating the play in Germany, they have retranslated, they're a very famous translator, translated this play. But 50 years goes by, the language changes and they've had to retranslate all of his major plays in German in order, because the German language has changed and English changes too, but the play doesn't change. But that's another kind of adaptation that's going on very subtly underneath. So the famous Spanish translation of Our Town that people lived and died for, it's been replaced. Interesting.
Nick, you'll have to find one in Japanese.
Oh.
Have them in Japanese, no problem.
Yep. Even in English, like as George Gibbs, it reminds me of my first time reading through. I had no idea what a strawberry phosphate was. The context clues helped. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Tappan.
Nick.
We're going to say goodnight to Nick, and we're going to bring on Chloe Julio, which is our Wally and our Psy. So she is our Wally Webb and our Psy Crowell. Hi, Chloe, whenever you're ready, dear.
Hi, I have a question. I can play boy or girl. Do you think that it matters?
Well, how about you want to handle that one, Rosie?
Sure. I would say initially, no, not really. It just kind of depends, I think, on how much you're trying to set the play in its time, right? Because I guess, if you're thinking about, would girls have been delivering newspapers in 1899, turn of the century? Probably not. But I think for either of those characters, I don't think it really matters, as long as, you keep the character names. But I think that's really sort of up to the director to decide what she wants to do. What do you think, Captain?
Yeah, that's a good answer. I think it's a fair answer. I have nothing to add. We allow women to play the role of the stage manager. That was never envisaged when the play was done. And so this is one of those evolution things we talked about. And sometimes when I say yes, and Rosie and I work together, so we agree, sometimes people take advantage of us. It happened to me once or twice. I learn and move on. It plays on somewhere every night, so we can fix it up and move on.
But that's a really great question, because I often get emails from theater companies around the world who, high schools, for example, who have a lot of women and not enough men. And so they write and say, hey, is it okay if Joe Stoddard is a woman? Is it okay if, if the professor is a woman? All of these roles, and it's really up to the director when it comes to that. Things can get trickier when you're talking about, other aspects of changing the character. But
like
it's
if
all
you were doing some of the partners, that wouldn't be time appropriate for back then to have an Emily and George having those two those two flip genders, or the parents or something like that.
Well, I think that just becomes more of a dramaturgical conversation, right, than a casting decision. So, yeah, but that's a really, really good question, and one that I get very frequently, and that I often kick over to Tappan, and we actually have it in our contracts to say, the play should be cast at as it's written. But if you have questions about it, come to the slate. And so many people do, and we're so glad that they do, because it really opens up the play.
Yeah, we end up doing that a lot at Interstage Right. Chloe has played both boys and girls, and had a good time with us.
What are some of the other parts you played, Chloe? I'm so curious.
Some of the what?
Some of the other parts you played.
Well, I've played a main character in Yes Virginia, and she was like, I just like to do that character because she was a really good character. She had some good questions too, and I like to play that character a lot.
How old are you, Chloe? How old are
I'm
you?
10 years old.
Ah, okay. That's great. Well, good for you. That sounds like you're on your way. And
Yes.
great. That's just great. Glad to meet you.
Well, thank you, Miss Chloe. And we will say goodnight to Chloe, and we will invite Amy Fabic, which is our Mrs. Webb, on. Well, if she's out there somewhere, there she is. Give her a minute to unmute. Oh. There we go.
Both at the same time, but that did not happen. So
That's all right. It's a learning curve for most. So so Mrs. Webb, Amy, the floor is.
yes. Thank you guys for coming. I have been thinking about the way Mrs. Webb puts up a lot of emotional walls, the way she kind of hovers over emotion and never really kind of gets, doesn't usually kind of get into the emotion. The quote I was thinking about was, "You're pretty enough for all normal purposes." But I have seen it also with other people, such as the conversation after choir practice where she kind of snipes at Gomes, and that it's kind of unexpected and out of nowhere. But then there's this other side to Mrs. Webb where the monologue right before Emily gets married, you do see all this depth. So I'm wondering, was she meant to represent someone in Thornton's life, or is she inspired by someone specifically?
A good question. A good question, Amy. What you've opened up here is a larger question, which allows me to avoid your question, bury it in a generality, and come back to it. And that is Wilder's treatment of women in general in his work. And I think what has become clear with the way that our world has changed in our lifetime in the last 50 years, in the last 10 years, 20 years, has been, of course, really a sea change on understanding how women have been used. And Thornton was way ahead of his time for his era in his appreciation, especially for the perseverance and bravery of women. And he was extremely sensitive to those issues. He celebrated them. Hello, Dolly. Dolly Levi is a very famous figure. You know who she is, I trust. But take Dolly Levi and spread pieces of her all over his work, and there are lots of Dollys. And his mother, and the way she lived her life with a not uneasy husband, and they weren't really together for many years as the world thinks of marriage, and the way she raised her kids in a matter-of-fact way. That line you mentioned was one of her lines, by the way. There's a lot of personal stuff in this play. The chatter around Thornton used to say, the chatter around the breakfast table was just, he stole that from his upbringing. And when he had to play the part of the stage manager, it made it a little easier for him to memorize the lines because those he knew. And was it a specific woman? No, it's a mélange, it's a collection. but the steel is there, the steel resilience, all those things are important. And that's the way I've tried to answer your question and perhaps avoid it. Rosie, do we have anything?
Would you like to see a few pictures of the women in his life?
Because we're so interested in this question of women, we've had seminars on it. They're not called seminars, are they? So here is, oh, good. Here's Thornton.
Hold on.
That's all right. I don't mind. Oh, there's my, I never knew. I mean, my grandmother died when I was 46, so I guess I knew her, but I don't remember her. And I'm not sure exactly how old she was when this picture was taken. But she was much younger than her husband, and she lived, as I say, in 1946. She never had a home of her own till Thornton built it for her. It was the first thing he did with the tremendous amount of money he earned from the bridge of San Luis Rey. Overnight, he became basically a very wealthy man. And the first thing he did was take $30,000 in 1929 and build his mother a house. And she lived in it from 1930 to her death in 1946. That's Isabella. Her name is Isabella Thornton Niven Wilder. And this is Charlotte Wilder. Now, that's Thornton's sister. She was a year younger. All the women, by the way, are very bright in the Wilder family. You understand? Very bright. They get the big grades, like Emily. And Charlotte was a poet, a very gifted poet, grew up to be a gifted poet. And when she was 41, she'd been struggling for many years, and she was a professor at Smith College and Wheaton College in Massachusetts, and then went to New York to make it as a writer in the Depression. But she fell apart herself in a terrible breakdown in 41, and basically lived her rest of her life in institutions. And in 1947, had what's known as a prefrontal lobotomy. And that was an operation which they were doing all the time in 1947. But it really ended her any hope that she could come back. I used to visit her myself several times a year. She was in Brattleboro, Vermont, the last years of her life. Very remarkable woman, a great poet. And I hope we're getting a volume of her poetry together. It's important. And Thornton used to say that in many families, somebody pays the price. And we have that in our town and Simon Stimson's. Somebody pays the price. There's always somebody paying the price for our lives. And Charlotte was, I think he saw her a little bit that way. He cared for her all her life, took care of every bill, took care of her. I'm sorry I'm talking so much about Isabel Wilder. That's his next to youngest sister. She was the one who stayed home. She was a novelist in the 30s. They're all writers, this family. They're all writers. And when that petered out, she basically, with no regrets, became his deputy and executor. And that's the family in 1928, in 29 in England. There's Mother Thornton, and on one side is little Isabel, the woman you just met, and then Janet, who was born in 1910. She was my aunt said every kiss was a pregnancy in this family, and the father came home on leave from China, and then we have Janet. She grew up and lived her life in Massachusetts. She was a zoologist, a very distinguished individual figure in preserving land, dogs, animals. She had the World National Morgan horse. She was, all these women you're all looking at very bright women. There we are, Thornton and three of his kids. Okay.
I like the way you use the word resilience instead of putting up walls. I think that's a really neat way to look at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, they're all symbols, but they also have a lot of life in them. Don't you think that's true, Rosie? I mean, they're all symbols. He's trying to turn a grain of sand into a universal statement. He's trying to turn a figure, Mrs. Webb, into something larger all the time. But I think there's also humanity in them. And that's maybe, I think, an aspect of my uncle's genius and the genius in this play.
And you see similar similar women kind of throughout all of his plays and novels. And, in particular, I don't know if you're familiar with The Skin of Our Teeth. Mrs. Antrobus in The Skin of Our Teeth is similar to Mrs. Webb and Mrs. Gibbs, is this incredibly strong woman who holds this family together over thousands of years. It's about a family who sort of exists, continues to carry on over thousands and thousands of years. And she has an amazing speech at the end of Act 2. She throws a bottle out into the ocean and she says, there's a message in there. And if, for a man to find, and I'm paraphrasing again, but she says, we're not what people say that we are. We're not up on the screen and we're not in TV shows. We are ourselves. And it's incredible because this is a play that opened in 1942. But so that's, that throughout his work, he's creating these female characters who I think very much, I've just learned this, of course, from Tappan, very much like his mother and his sisters and a lot of other, female friends that he had, just got on with it, and were just very strong women. And, if they suffered, it wasn't something that they put forward. They were just sort of very resilient, strong people. So interesting.
They did have breakdowns, though. That's one of those lines, all these two women, they cooking all these meals and never a nervous breakdown. Well, read that again as loving irony. His mother had her moments. Her mother, his mother, they all do. So read it as loving irony.
There you go. All right.
Wow. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you, Amy. All right. So say goodnight to Amy, and we will bring in John Lusk, which plays our stage manager in this production.
Now we go big time here.
Hello.
Yes. Yes. Welcome, John, and the floor
Thank you.
is yours.
Thank you. A little prelude. If Regina has been a rookie coming to this play, I've been marinated in this play. I just retired after a 40-year teaching career, 34 of which was at the local community college. And when I first got my job in 1978, I got a job teaching high school English at Kendallville, Indiana, East Noble High School. And a colleague befriended me, Bob Avery. He said, I direct plays. You want to help? I said, sure. He said, do you have a play in mind? I said, Our Town. And so we started it. And I managed to bring also to the production Aaron Copland's incidental music or overture. And both Bob and I didn't care for it at the time. We thought it didn't quite fit, but after a few listens, it fit. And I'm going to give it to Regina's husband, Brian, his production. And maybe I already mentioned it to him, but that Copland piece is a wonderful piece. We had a nice production, unfortunately, and I'm loath to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's part of life. About 3 weeks before we opened, the principal's daughter, about 3 weeks before production, the principal's daughter died in an accident at the school. And that just cast a pall over the whole production. No, I don't mind saying it, it's logical. We played to practically empty houses. No one wanted to come see a play about the third act being death after the demise of a wonderful, talented young lady. That aside, it's been a wonderful play. I've enjoyed it for years. And one question I had, this play is no stranger to being filmed or a part of a movie. Hal Holbrook has played the stage manager. Paul Newman's played stage manager. Do either of you have a favorite TV or film production of this? And if so, why?
Well, the films that you mentioned, John, are not films. Spalding Gray has one too. They are films of actual productions. They're not a film, an original film of the play. They are records of a stage production, which are then issued as films. And I'm in the business of liking all of them. So I'm not going to pick a favorite. But have you seen the movie of Our Town in which the Copland piece is used as the back, have you seen that movie?
Yes, I have.
What did you think of it?
It wasn't. I'm guilty of contrasting that to the Holbrook or the Newman production. I didn't think it was up to speed as much as those, but I do like the Copeland piece. I thought that worked well in terms of that movie.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a scale in what I call these. There's a term for these records. You know, you buy them from public broadcasting. I mean, the ones you mentioned first, and again, they're on a scale of that dry versus friendlier production. You know, I mean, the Newman is a very interesting one because they tried to recreate the original stage on which Our Town was done. And it was actually filmed in New York on that stage.
Oh.
So that's very interesting. And Hal Holbrook, and I've got to know him pretty well. He performed this several times. And it's very interesting to just see how a man of his skill works. So there's something to like in all those examples. The movie I'm not a fan of, and of course it's famous because Emily doesn't die.
Yes.
And Thornton was fully in favor of that. He saw film as a very different form than live stage. And the allegory, as he put it, the allegory which is possible on the stage becomes brutally mean and terribly mean and hard when it's done with realism on film. So he was all for letting that change take place. That wasn't a problem for him. But I just don't think it works very well as a film, that's all. I think it needs to be played. This is the beginning of a long conversation, John, because I've allowed an opera which Thornton didn't believe could be done. And it's been a very great success, and I'm very proud of it. So I have stepped up, made some, and Rosie and I have done a number of things. And sometimes we look out the window, but no bolt of lightning comes down. So I guess it's okay.
Not yet. But you should talk about the musical version of it too.
Oh.
Oh, yeah, there was the well-known musical version, which in 1955, which many people don't know about because they're never going to see it. But Paul Newman was in that one too. But it's famous for it was Frank Sinatra, and the song that everybody sings, "Love and Marriage Goes Together Like a Horse and Carriage," that's from the musical.
I'll be darned.
Yep. But you're not going to see that again. Eva Marie Saint played Emily.
Oh,
1955.
interesting.
Well, if Thornton was a big Shakespeare fan, then that explains why the evolutions that he's okay with it. In Shakespeare's First Folio, you have a huge note talking about how Shakespeare would want you to take these works and go out and evolve them and play with them and keep the context and everything, but and the intent, but be creative and so.
Yes, right.
What did you teach, John?
Taught English and journalism, and I appreciate your insight into a couple of the lines that you mentioned about the stage manager. Once in 1,000 times, it's interesting. The one thing I've been struggling with or working with a bit is a so-called New Hampshire accent. Yeah. And I don't think I'm going to go there because I'd have to keep the whole doggone thing. I'm just going to play it Midwestern flat. Let it go.
Yeah. Don't do the accent. I can tell you why too. Then they did the Broadway production. The whole thing was done with the accents. And that was not a choice that Thornton Wilder made. In fact, he went back to the acting edition in 1957 and took out almost all of the dialect that's in there. You still have a few things like something went wrong with the separator, don't know what 'twas. Yes. That's written like that. But there's only a few of those lines and a few places where the dialect is in there. But for the most part, he took the dialect out. So if you compare the acting edition, the current acting edition, with the previous acting edition that was in circulation until like 2012, you'll see, if you look at the two of them together, you can see the difference between the way it was originally staged on Broadway and then Thornton's final word on how he wanted it to be staged. So I support your decision just to do it with a Midwestern accent.
There's one very interesting word that he made a choice of. It's at the very beginning. The whole town can hear the yelling and screaming coming from those schoolyards. And it's spelled in my version, Hull.
Yep.
So whole town.
Old Town. Yeah, whole, yeah.
And that's an example of one of those things that he left in there. It's so interesting. There are a few of those words sort of sprinkled throughout the text. There were holdovers from when the whole thing was written in that dialect.
Yep.
And just to kind of go back to that reference, when he did his definitive edition, if you look at the 1957 version versus what was performed on Broadway, he took out like 300 or 400 exclamation points
Oh,
in the original Broadway. So everything was like, like throw in the exclamation point. They just pulled them out, pulled it back. It's really interesting.
Yeah, Rosie devoted untold amounts of time to when we discovered, John, that the acting edition, the famous acting edition from Samuel French, right?
yes.
Let me go back and explain that in 1957, when he finally sat down and did his definitive version of it, the play that had been done in 1938, right? There had been an acting edition, I forget just when it was published, in between all those years. And then Samuel French was asked to make the changes in the acting edition, and they never did. So Rosie and I stumbled to this need, which was clearly a need, and we cleaned it up, as it were. And Rosie carried a lot of the burden of that. And we also went into the back of the book, didn't we, Rosie? We changed all sorts of things. They still had the lighting plat in there that applied to nothing because that kind of equipment doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it just all had to be not modernized. It had to be adjusted for the times in which we live.
But we did leave, there's a lot that still remains as kind of as part of the history of the play. So we didn't pull it all out because some of it's just interesting to go back and see what the costume plot was and what the doubling plot was, back in 1937, 1938. So we didn't take it all out. We just, the original acting edition was basically the stage manager's prompt copy of the script, which had all those tiny little crosses 2 steps, downstage right. All of that stuff that any director's not really going to find useful, and you're not allowed to keep those kind of stage directions in an acting edition nowadays anyway, because it's considered a violation of the director's copyright.
Oh,
So we just pulled it back and we included all of the stage directions that Thornton included in his 1957 edition. And then some of the pantomime where it's helpful, but
shifting gears briefly, I'm involved in several choirs, and I must say that the hymn chosen too, when the choir does their thing, it's a wonderful hymn. It's a perfect choice. Blessed be the tie that binds. Just really inspired to have that, because that's the whole thing, is the tie that binds us across the centuries and the years and the lifestyles and the lifetimes. It's just perfect. Just perfect.
Yeah.
He loved it so much. He was over there singing it from the other side of the stage. I'm like, you know what? I think the stage manager joins in this into this hymn. So
I love it. Yeah.
He had a perfect ear. He was a musician, by the way, a wonderful musician. He really had a perfect ear for the right kind of music. I'm often pointed out that in a play called The Matchmaker, have you heard of The Matchmaker?
Yes. Good.
There's this, he has a Civil War hymn called Tenting Tonight, where the 2 boys have an adventure in New York, are trying to lure the girls in the hat shop to go out with them. And they say, you've got to prove it, so they all sing Tenting Tonight together. It is so beautiful, you can't believe it. It's exactly the right song, just the way you put your finger on Blessed Be the Tie That Binds. Absolutely perfect.
It is. It gives me goosebumps. And thank you so much for what the 2 of you are doing. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
instead of letting John go, we're going to invite everybody else to come on while I do a, I'm gonna shift from the question I was going to ask into a question slash statement. Just something you said very early on when you were showing the pictures of them traveling and things like that, and talking about Thornton didn't have, and everybody else can start joining anytime. Thornton didn't have a traditional family home life and everything. And now talking with John about the pantomiming and things, I wonder about, because when you look at this play, the pantomiming, the bulk of it are the parents. And if he didn't have a traditional family, I wonder how much that is connected.
I I'm going to jump in here just a little bit, John, if I may. And that is, even though he didn't choose to live in a traditional family setting, he was extraordinarily devoted to his family. It wasn't, he left them behind. It's just, so you have to be careful. It's a rich picture. It's a rich
Right.
picture.
So I guess what I mean is the pantomiming of the everyday life and the traditional, what was considered to be traditional duties and actions, I guess, is more my thought on that. Okay. Just a thought.
Yeah.
Okay, Mary, do you have any questions?
My question would be,
Oh, and I'm sorry, this is Mary from Mary Howard from St. Clair County Library, which is
yes.
responsible for all of us not only doing this production with Interstate Right, but also bringing the Wilder family with us tonight.
Yes, thank you so much, Regina. It's, of course, we're in unusual times, and this is an unusual way for the library to bring everyone together. As you all may know, we're going to have this available on our YouTube channel. So going forth, people can go to our website. They can go to Interstate Right to watch this. And libraries are extremely adept at pivoting and changing. And I know theater is. I mean, I've seen productions and everything from, a reproduction of theater, Shakespeare's theater in Canada to some guy in Hamtramck's living room. I mean, I've seen theater everywhere. And I'm just wondering basically, Rosie and Tappan, what you think the future of theater will be, because we all know it will go on. I'm just curious, as to me being the only non-theater person, how you see it evolving.
Oh boy.
Do you mean because of the pandemic, or do you mean?
Yeah, I would say specifically the pandemic.
Tappy, you go first.
Well, I'm not I don't look into the future too far, right? But I'll tell you something I learned today, which I thought was very interesting. On a call today with an English person involved in the theater in England, there's a show open over there, and I won't reveal the name because I can't remember it, but the theater is about 1,500 people, and they've allowed 500 people to attend the performance.
Les Miserables.
Les Miserables. And it's a sellout, an absolute sellout. And there's a line at the door.
And Six is opening there too on the West End again.
What that says to me is theater is going to be back bigger than ever, and people are lining up. They're ready for it. They're getting tired of Zooming. They want to be up there, and they want to breathe the same air as the actors. And so I'm not worried about that. But I am, like all of us, absolutely fascinated by the ability for us to reach untold numbers of people that we never did with whatever messages we have. So I think the balance will be there. It'll be struck. And I don't care to speculate how it's all going to work out, but I think it's going to be the same and it's going to be different. So Rosie, what do you have to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all in this industry because we like being in the same room with other people, and we like hearing people laugh. We like feeling that laugh. We like feeling that energy. We like sharing that energy and exchanging that energy. And I don't think any of us theater people are ever going to be satisfied with this two-dimensional medium. So, but because we have managed to keep theater happening for thousands of years, it's going to carry on. We're going to make it happen. Nobody's going to be, and people are already finding, as really inventive, creative ways to keep theater going. Even in, people are doing street theater. People are finding ways to make things even within the restrictions. And I think it's going to be a while before Broadway comes back as we know it, just because it's an expensive endeavor. So a lot of people are going to have to make a lot of hard decisions before we can make that happen, but it will come back, and the tourists will eventually come back to New York to make that happen. But meanwhile, we have all these much more agile organizations like yours who can make theater much sooner, because because you're not tied to this, very expensive piece of real estate or contracts that require you to pay X number of dollars. But I think it's awesome that we've all been able to embrace this Zoom medium and make plays and make work, but the theater will be back. I don't know how soon. I don't know exactly when. We'll probably all be wearing masks for a while, but right? You guys agree with me, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're one of those that is hanging in there, adapting. Obviously, we have not done live theater in front of audiences since March, since the shutdown. But we have done some recordings. We thought we were going to be open in September to open up Our Town in September, which was the original production schedule for us. And so but all of our rehearsals, we were in the backyard, like I said, masked and distanced and everything. And then it got to the point where like, okay, so we had to suspend rehearsals and kind of to further notice. And at this point, right now, we're looking at May. We were hoping to open the theater in February. That's not going to help. But we do a new production every single month, a 3-week run of a new production every month. So, yeah, we have a pretty quick turnaround. So yeah, we are a black box theater in downtown Port Huron in an old historic building that was the second Citadel building with the Salvation Army in the United States. And we are back in the gym that used to be the hub of the community, where they, in the Depression and the post-war, they were giving out food baskets and everything right there in the space that we now call home. We're getting grants and donors in order to pay our rent and insurance and utilities to keep us viable right now. And looking at another round of that, of course, coming up, because of course we're going longer than what we thought we would with the pandemic. But Our Town is already staged with these fabulous people that we have and blocked, and they've begun their character work and their pantomiming and all that, the relationships and everything. Even though it was distanced relationships, you could still see it, which was phenomenal. And so once we start back, we figure, so being a black box, a true black box, we are able to, all of our seating and our staging is completely mobile. So we already have planned how we're going to do pod seating, because our chairs are all mobile. And so we can actually, okay, you order your tickets and this is how many is in your pod, and you're 6 feet away from this pod and everything. One of our great concerns is we did do our King Lear over the summer. We do Shakespeare every summer, and we did do our King Lear. We ended up filming it and we were masked. But I said it back, well, actually when King Lear was an ancient King of Britain, so Celtic tribal times. So we just built the masks right into, they weren't modern masks, they were more like veils. So they fit into that Celtic tribal feel to it, design. But Our Town, doing it in masks, that was one of our deciding factors on just going ahead and canceling it, as opposed to keeping the rights where they were and doing it outside or something like that. We could have still done that in September in Michigan. We decided no, just because the masks and everything, we didn't want that for our design. So we are really hoping that by March, April, that this cast and production team can get back in the theater without, hopefully, without masks, but it might still be masked. But the goal is to be unmasked in May for productions, even if it's capped audiences and things. But I think this group kind of said, okay, if we have to do it masked, we probably don't want to, we want to wait, because we want to give the show its due. So, yeah.
Well, I'll give you a tip too.
Mm-hmm.
Radio drama. Think about that too. Add that to your. I think that's really going to be interesting. I think we have some more radio drama in the future.
We see a lot of companies doing that. Some of our good friends out in Chicago are doing Theater in the Dark, and they just did a very long run of World of Worlds radio drama. There's another one that we just followed. Yeah, that's a thought. We've done in May, June, and July. We did 3. That was when Zoom was new, so it was still kind of new to people and interesting. And we did 3 productions on Zoom, live productions. So that was fun. But like you said, Zoom is tiring at this point. So we probably won't do those, but radio is an option, because then you can at least mask and it doesn't necessarily detract. So
Well, you've been great. Great to be part of your family. Thank you for having us in.
Yeah.
thank
very
you
much.
so much. Thank you so much. So we want to finish up with some thank yous. We want to thank, of course, Tappan and Rosie and the Wilder family for coming and joining us tonight. The St. Clair County Library System and Mary, thank you so much. And this is actually paid for by a grant from Domtar Paper. So we want to make sure that we thank Domtar for helping make this whole thing happen. Thank you, thank you. And then Interstage Right, we'll plug ourselves and thank ourselves a little bit. And our community that supports us year round, even in a pandemic. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming.